So hello everyone and welcome to our event, Empowering First Nations and Indigenous Communities, overcoming the ecological and humanitarian threats of the nuclear fuel trajectory and nuclear weapons. Next slide, please. So, I'm sorry about this. We're having some technical issues, but I would like to acknowledge all of our co-sponsors for this event, including the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, the Pegasus Institute, the Marshallese Educational Initiative, IPPNW, the Manhattan Project for a Nuclear Free World, Hibakasha Stories, Nuke Watch, Peaceboat US, the Prospect Hill Foundation, as well as the Affected Communities Working Group of the Nuclear Ban Collaborative. So we have a great lineup of speakers, and we will show that slide very soon. But first, I would like to switch over to Camille, who will deliver the land acknowledgements. Please, Camille.
Sure. We just would like to take a moment to acknowledge the lands that we are all living and working on. Many of our speakers are from across Canada. I'm going to just quickly mention some of the territories that they're represented. Pawtucket, Dr. Caitlin Turner. Esther is from the Navajo Nation. Peyton is from the Mississauga First Nation. Benetic from Osage, I apologize if I said that incorrectly, Nation, from Springdale, Arkansas, and Perna from the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tusaila-Waututh First Nations territory, based in Vancouver. So we just would like to take a moment to acknowledge, again, the lands that we are living and working on. And I'll pass it back to you, Christian.
Yes, thank you so much, Camille. Unfortunately, our moderator today is unavailable, so I'll be filling in. And I would like to really, express our deep appreciation for all of our speakers, Dr. Caitlin Turner, Esther Yazzie Lewis, Peyton Benedict, and Brianna. So it's going to be a really amazing lineup. And now I would like to just deliver a few introductory remarks. So this event was originally envisioned to take place on the margins of the NPT Review Conference. The Review Conference would have provided an opportunity for state parties to assess and take stock of the nuclear non-proliferation regime. However, in the courses of those discussions, what we have often seen, especially on discussions related to the nuclear fuel cycle and nuclear disarmament, there's a fundamental issue: the failure to adequately consult with Indigenous people and First Nations. And this is a significant problem. There's no doubt that the nuclear events that have impacted the Navajo First Nation, Canadian First Nations, and the Marshallese community illustrate how both uranium mining and nuclear testing directly impact Indigenous and First Nations people. And therefore, these groups should be at the table during these discussions. Further, as this week commemorates the 1-year anniversary of the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This historic treaty bans nuclear weapons and has a robust set of provisions known as the positive obligations. These obligations require state parties of the treaty to assist both the victims of the use and testing of nuclear weapons, as well as remediate the contaminated environments. Considering the need to enhance and to include Indigenous peoples and First Nations participations in nuclear non-proliferation disarmament discussions, and the need to hold states parties accountable to their obligations to assist victims, most of whom are Indigenous peoples, this event will provide an opportunity for community leaders from both Indigenous and First Nations, as well as activists, to come together, share their knowledge, voice their opinions, and unite. We hope that this event will serve as a platform to facilitate substantive discussions to establish ways in which Indigenous and First Nation groups can work together with all the activists who are on this call, and then hopefully with policymakers as well, to renounce nuclear weapons, nuclear energy, and appropriately remediate the environment and help victims. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to our keynote presenter, Dr. Caitlin Turner. Please, Dr. Turner, the floor is yours.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Can I get like a confirmation that everyone can hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here today. My name is Caitlin Turner, and as the slide says, I'm a research scientist at the MIT Media Lab in the Space Enabled Research Group. And I'm also the technology director of a new research initiative at the MIT Media Lab called the Anti-Racism Design and Technology Initiative. And I'm really honored that I've been asked to be the opening speaker for this event and to deliver just a few remarks about the nuclear fuel cycle, its trajectory, and sort of the lay of the land to start us off in this discussion. I'm not going to speak for too long. I think I'm slated for just about 10 minutes. So I want to actually, I know there are a lot of youth in this room, and I know there are a lot of activists, academics, and scholars in this room as well. And I want to sort of tell a story about about my own entry into this field. And I think it's relevant to some of the issues we're going to talk about later today. So generationally, I'm a millennial. So I think about what that means for me is that from the time I was 5 years old, or even before that, I was aware of something called global warming at that time, right? Sometimes we also called it climate change as I got older, right? And it was always presented as this dire threat to humanity. The ice caps would melt, the sea levels would rise, the temperatures would warm and Earth would become uninhabitable. It was, from the time that I've been really in preschool or in kindergarten, this has been, a constant thread. So naturally, as one might do, if this is sort of the awareness that you're brought up with, when I started my higher education in college, I chose to go into a scientific field in engineering in the hopes that I would essentially be using whatever talents or energy the universe has given me to sort of work against this problem, this perennial generational problem of global warming or climate change, right? And when I was a freshman in college at the University of Notre Dame, I remember this slide talking about how, CO2 emissions bad. We need to, change the landscape of energy in order to make a dent in climate change and in the impacts of that. And the slide showed basically, it was from the Energy Information Administration, and it showed the breakdown of all of the energy sources in the United States. And there was another one in the world as well. And it just showed, that like what I think most of us on this call probably know intuitively, that fossil fuels like coal and oil and natural gas made up a large percentage of the world's energy. And then this graph also showed the direct like energy to emissions. So things like BTUs or tons of CO2 emitted by each energy source. And so what it looked like was this very concentrated graph of like everything on one side that we currently use being bad and being very well integrated into the United States and into the world. And then there were these other energy sources that we saw on, you could see on the other side of the graph, and they were sort of painted as like, if we could just get our energy portfolio to look more like this, then climate change and CO2 emissions would not be an issue, right? And so, of course, one of those energy sources and energy systems that it talked about was nuclear energy. And, then I learned in one of my classes that nuclear energy was one of the only sources of energy that was viable. It was the term they used often, meaning that it fit well economically into our already existing, electrical grid. We use terms like baseline energy. So they, in engineers, you learn a lot about like intermittent energy sources. So solar, the fact that you can't get solar energy at night, or you can't get wind energy if it's not winning, if it's not windy. And so I say all this to illustrate that, my entry point into this field as an engineer was very much framed by nuclear power. Nuclear energy is a solution. It is a solution. It works well within the grid that we already use. It works well economically. It's safe. There's only been 3 accidents ever. Fewer lives have been lost to nuclear energy than any other electricity source. Things like that, right? It's this like very rosy, logical picture, supposedly logical picture. And so I started working on nuclear energy, basically hoping that by working on some of the, at the time, what I thought were like the kinks that needed to be worked out of the nuclear fuel cycle, that, this would be the best way that I could, contribute to working on the climate problem. And so I'm telling you all of this because I think most of us in this room today, like, think that this is perhaps comical, the way that, the fact that there's so many things, right? One, that nuclear is actually advertised this way, right? As a solution to climate change. When we actually know that, it's not for technical and for socioeconomic reasons. And also, interestingly, that, how it was framed was that, there were just some kinks in the nuclear fuel cycle that needed to be worked out. That if we could just work out some small things, that everything would be fine. And no matter how you look at it, whether it's technical issues, or whether it's economic issues, or whether it's social issues, over the last 12 years working in the nuclear sector, I would say, that framing of, these are just small issues, these are just small kinks, is dangerous and inaccurate. And that's a polite way of putting it, to say that it's dangerous and inaccurate. When we're talking about some of the unique impacts that nuclear energy or nuclear technology has, on the one hand, you could say we're trading CO2 emissions for nuclear waste repositories, of which there really are no functioning nuclear waste repositories in the world. And on the other hand, this completely ignores the technical and geopolitical and social issue of the dual use situation. The fact that nuclear technology is not just an energy technology, and it was actually never intended to be such, right? And then if we even want to get into the issue of these accidents, right? The oft quoted statistic of like, fewer people have died from nuclear accidents than coal or whatever it is, right? So like, what's interesting about that as well is like that number, how many people have died, even if we're going to use that statistic, that metric, that's a disputed number, right? So whether we're talking about accidents like Chernobyl or accidents like Fukushima or radiation exposure, things like that, that's a disputed number, right? So that's interesting. But then also even just the suggestion that metric is the appropriate metric to use, right? So I think that what I want to bring my attention to in these remarks and bring your attention to in these remarks is that not even like in that conversation, in all of those pros and cons about nuclear energy or about nuclear infrastructure, there's never, ever, ever a mainstream discussion about inequity, inequality, injustice, racism, whatever term you want to use. That's not part of the discussion. The discussion is entirely centered around how many people died, or CO2 emissions that are defrayed, or the cost of mining uranium versus reprocessing, or all these sort of technical details. And when you really actually dig in to the so-called kinks of nuclear energy, what you find, and of nuclear weapons as well, you find this, and I don't even want to, like, normally I would say the word like fraught to describe a complicated situation, but fraught is actually not the issue. I would say that it's directly, the field is directly linked to racism and colonialism in a way that it's very damning. And so, it's like, whether we're talking about the whole development of the field, and how the initial development of the field was, to advance US imperialism, sort of through World War II, and ultimately the first like fruits of that initial labor of advancing this field, killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, and contributed to nuclear contamination, radioactive contamination of lands around the world where many Indigenous, First Nation, and people of color did live. That's not a part of the field, or about the discussion of the field. Whether it's the fact that, we just, this is maybe one area where nuclear is not unique compared to other energy systems or industrial systems. The fact that we today target communities that are socioeconomically disenfranchised and historically marginalized, historically disempowered, which oftentimes does center First Nations and Indigenous communities, to cite nuclear infrastructure that is more of like a burden sort of infrastructure versus the benefit infrastructure. Or whether, gosh, I mean, like, there's so many examples, whether we talk about the fact that nuclear energy is supposedly this climate change remediation situation, but there are no plans and no significant international networks or collaborations in order to, come up with a situation where the nations that would be most primarily impacted by climate change are primarily the people who are have a seat at the table of the nuclear conversation. I really could go on, and like, I don't want to go on because I think I've talked now for like 12 minutes, but the point is, I want to say that this field is quite, it's kind of gentrified in a very like ugly way. It's the way that it's marketed, the way that it's branded, the way that many of us approach the field perhaps, or the way that many of us engage with it. It's, the way that we might engage with like a store or a restaurant or a neighborhood that seems so authentic and cute or whatever, and seems like it could be solving a problem and just sort of engineering around a problem. But the more you learn about it, you learn that there are, that there are horrific labor issues, and they've, appropriated recipes from different groups of people that are culturally significant and are not paying them appropriately or compensating them appropriately. Or, you look at a cute neighborhood and you're like, oh gosh, the architecture is just so cute here. And then you learn that people were, Black and brown people were kicked out of that neighborhood in order for, and overly policed in order for it to exist, right? nuclear energy and nuclear technology is completely gentrified in the same way. And it's horrible. And I say that because I know there are some people on this call who are actually very pro nuclear energy or believe that we can, amend the problem. And I know there are some people on this call who are very anti-nuclear energy and believe that we should just scrap the entire thing and, work on reparations and things like that. And the one thing I think that both of those groups of people should have in common is really recognizing and identifying the problem for what it is. These are not kinks to be worked out in a system. These are not, just this is not a tool that right now combats climate change. This is not a toolkit that right now advances equity. This is not a tool with a neutral history or a net positive history. It's not that at all. And in order for there to be any progress, meaningful progress, lasting progress on this issue or on these sets of issues, we really need to identify that problem for what it is and for who it impacts and who it has impacted. So I will stop there, and thanks for listening to my musings.
Yes, thank you, Caitlin, so much. I'm certainly looking at, in the chat box, all the comments. You've certainly inspired many of our participants to think about the profound, effects of nuclear energy and the necessity to include, everyone, include, Indigenous people and First Nations to be part of the discussions. I have delightful news. Our moderator is back. She just arrived. So I would like to pass the floor over to Roj Ali, who's going to be our MC for the rest of this event.
Okay, thank you so much, Christian. Our next speaker in this lovely event will be Esther Yazzie Lewis. And just going into her bio is Ms. Yazzie Lewis received a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and a Master of Arts in Public Administration and in American Studies from the University of New Mexico. In service to her people, Ms. Yazzie Lewis worked with the Navajo people on the Navajo/Hopi land dispute, on issues related to environmental and social justice, and on uranium problems within the Navajo reservation. As a result, she co-authored the book, Navajo People and Uranium Mining. She further certified the Navajo language for the United States District Court for the Southwest states in 1987 and has trained over 350 Navajo people in judicial interpretation at the University of Arizona since 1992. Currently, she serves as a board member of the Southwest Research and Information Center and serves as an advisor for RTT. Today, she teaches conversational Navajo for UNM continuing education and at the University of New Mexico main campus. Ms. Yazzie Lewis was inducted into the Navajo Nation Hall of Fame for her work. And just a quick question, have we done the land acknowledgements yet?
Yes, we have.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, so please take it away.
Good afternoon, everybody. Yate to ahya and hoke leaning schneno, but on the bushes chin. Aro tudicini dashichedo last chi dashanale. And that's my Navajo language. I'm full-blooded Navajo. My first language was Navajo, Dene. And I still speak Dene. And I teach it and I live it, and I teach other people on what Navajo culture and Navajo philosophy and Navajo ceremonial practices or traditional ways are. And so I guess I'm quite an asset to my people because I get people calling me all the time to assist them and help them out. And I still do interpreting in the federal courts and interpreting in other legal aspects and with other areas of election and medical terminologies. So I have a broad, I guess, spectrum of how I do my Navajo language. I want to talk to you this morning. I was asked to speak, and I work with the Navajo uranium since 1979 during the spill at Church Rock. Is when I learned of uranium and what it can do to land, air, and water. And as I move forward with my work, with learning how to interpret in the federal courts, I've already been interpreting, I guess you could say, since I never gave up my Navajo language, and I learned English at 6 when I went to school, to the boarding school. So I'm a product of the boarding schools where we were told not to speak our language, and coming from that and still maintaining my Navajo language and into the legal system of the Navajo courts and the Navajo law enforcement led me to going to school at the University of New Mexico, and then going into the freelance interpreting with the federal courts. And I'm still doing that. And by my language, using my language and interpreting, I then was recruited by Dr. Doug Brugge of Tufts Medical School. They had done a survey on Navajo people that gave their testimony on how uranium affected them during the time they were doing the uranium mines back in the early, late 50s, 60s, and 70s in the Four Corners area, and even on the Navajo land. And so I translated all the Navajo testimonies, and that became published, and it comes in the wind, and also Navajo uranium mining, the book itself. And so from that, my first experience with the World Uranium Hearing in Manhattan at the Roosevelt Hotel, I was sent there because I was a president of an organization called Tunutsin Land Institute, which was a group of people that were Hispanics and Navajos. And so I was sent there, and that was my first introduction to the world perspective of uranium, and giving my talk there and explaining how uranium affected Navajo people and their health and their land and their ways of life. And I spoke in Navajo, and they had a delegation of Japanese people, of about 25 or 30 Japanese. And I spoke the language, and everybody turned toward the interpreter's booth. And I laughed because Navajo language was a military code. It's called the Navajo Code Talkers. And so during World War II, the Navajo language was used as a military. And so at the same time, while the language is being used as a military code, the uranium that was dug out from the area by Navajo people and in the Four Corners area, that uranium was taken to Los Alamos and was made into bombs and tested at White Sands south of here toward El Paso, Texas, and in Alamogordo area. And at the same time, these bombs were developed by the uranium that was dug out, and during that time, and hit Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So you see this legacy of how uranium was used for military weapons and destruction of many people, just like the previous lady that spoke, saying, how uranium was used as military weapons. And you see that it's still being used that way. And I think the treaty to reverse the trend and not use uranium as a weapon anymore was all designed by your group. And I think the treaty in itself stands for itself, and it's been a year. And I think young kids doing this is really great. And my experience with uranium took me around the world because of what I said in 1987 at the Roosevelt Hotel in Manhattan, and having the Japanese people support what I said and how they felt about me. That's what took me into different places like Japan and Australia and into Africa to talk about Indigenous people being faced with uranium mines. And so I know that we, the Navajo people, it started in the 1940s with uranium mining, and then in 1945 with the war, and then the stories of the people's health problems and what was going on with them on Navajo land, people dying of cancer, respiratory cancer, and just, you know, so many people died from it. And then in 2005 is when organizations and activists came together, and we banned with these organizations that are fighting for the ecological protection. We don't want to destroy the air, the water, and the land anymore on Navajo land because people are suffering. The land is pretty much all contaminated with uranium and radioactive waste. So the Navajo Nation was the first Indigenous nation that put a ban on uranium mining. And that was in 2005. And then in 2006, we held the first uranium world hearing on the Navajo reservation in Window Rock, Arizona. And we had people that came from all over the world that were a part of the world uranium hearing there. And so we've moved every step of the way to try to fight for the water, the land, and the air. And now we have Navajo people that are pushing for human rights violations in the United Nations. And it's called Eastern Navajos Against Uranium Mining, because they're fighting for water. And they say water is life. If we are without water, we don't have life. Uranium is about death because uranium doesn't bring life. And so water is more essential than uranium. And that's their take on that. And they're saying that the human rights were violated, and they have filed their petition with the United Nations. So we have done all these, and I'm sharing this with you because the empowerment, the title of this is the Empowering First Nations and Indigenous Communities. And I think as long as Indigenous people present their case of how they were affected by uranium and health hazards that are still impacted. I work with an organization called Southwest Research and Information Center, and I've been with them over 15 years. And my part about being a part of the Southwest Research and Information Center is that they study uranium. They're the only ones out there doing things with Navajo communities. They have collaborated with the University of New Mexico Medical School, so they study air quality, water quality, and now the birth cohort study. We did those three things and others, and now we're into how do we help the people that have health problems. So now the medication of zinc, if we can use zinc to help people to feel better about themselves and fight, their health problems. And so that's where we're at with our organization with Southwest Research. And I'm also a part of another Navajo group called the Nest Center for Research and Evaluation. And their whole progress is about looking through problems and issues of the environmental atrocities of air and water and land through the Navajo lens. How do you look at these things and try to bring some level of balance and order back to how we as Indigenous people, as Native American people, and some people call us Indians, but we don't call ourselves Indians, we call ourselves natives because we're Aborigines of this country. We were here before everybody else was here, so, but we were never considered a citizen for a long time. We were not allowed to vote for a long time. I think the Navajo Nation started voting in 1923 or something, allowed and given that right to vote. But the Navajo government was put together by the United States government during the time that we were being rounded up, and they found out that there were raw resources under the land that we were given to live on. And so the Navajo Nation government was put together so that they could sign contracts with big corporations that could come in and extract coal, oil, gas, and uranium. So the government was formed by the United States government. And so you find these are the things that we have to understand and work within, and know that, you know, we have to, as community people and grassroots people, that we need to protect our environment in these ways. And I think by sharing these things gives us, and you as young people of science and engineering and different professional fields of science, that ecology and humanitarian threats can be, you know, of the nuclear fuel trajectory and nuclear weapons can be addressed, because you will be the future leaders for this country at one point or another. And I feel that being an elder for the group Reverse the Trend, I feel that my contribution as a Navajo woman, and we're a matriarchal system, so a Navajo woman, you know, has a high status within her family and her community. So I feel that my contribution I might be able to help you understand how Native American people see these things and how they're trying to empower themselves. And I think we are moving forward on that level, especially in this time too, with President Biden and Deborah Haaland signing, you know, a legislative act that's trying to protect and try to restore the national monuments, and one being Chaco Canyon, the greater Chaco Canyon. The Chaco Canyon represents all Indigenous people from South America to North America, and how science and engineering and the rotation of the sun and the moon and the months and the days, kind of like the Aztec calendar, all work together. And it's a great scientific area that we're trying to protect from fracking. And so I just feel that those are very important things, even just like Bear's Ears, even just like Grand Canyon with the other Indians that are keepers of the river there, the Havasupais and the Hopis and all the Pueblos that are fighting right now. There's a whole group of young people that are very active, very intelligent. There's a group called the Pueblo Action Alliance, and they're young groups that are really fighting to file a lawsuit. And I'm a part of that too with the state of New Mexico. They've asked me to come in and help them fight this lawsuit. And that again is a violation of human rights, because you didn't, you know, it's like you didn't look at the people that live on that land and how you're going to uproot them, and how you're, you know, the bad way of life is entrenched on them because of the greed of mining raw resources. So I can go on and on. I really appreciate your efforts, and Christian putting all this together, the young people, and I'm wholeheartedly behind you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was all very enlightening, and there's lots to take away from that. Our next speaker right now will be Peyton Pitawannakwat, a community member of Mississauga First Nation.
So, Ani, Peyton Dijnakas, Nizwazaging Donjaba, Neen Michisagi, Minogijagad. Greetings to you all. I want to say that I'm so grateful to be here. My name is Peyton Pitawannakwat. I am sitting here today on Robinson Huron Treaty territory. This is the territory of many Indigenous communities, one of which is my home. Mississauga First Nation is signatory to the Robinson Huron Treaty. This treaty was signed by the Crown and Ojibwe chiefs in the year of 1850. Chief Ponkiash had signed on behalf of the Mississaugas, describing our land as between the River Mississauga and the River Penawabakong up to the First Rapids. Our current land base is approximately 20,000 hectares. However, our traditional territory extends far beyond the confinements of false borders. The Mississaugan Constitution outlines the authorities from which our community derives our right to self-govern, including the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In addition to our Constitution, MFN is operational under the Framework Agreement on First Nation Land Management, and we ratified our land code in 2008, meaning that MFN manages lands and resources for the benefit of the community, rather than in accordance with the Indian Act. The Constitution and the Framework Agreement gives MFN the express ability to establish environmental protection and assessment laws over our lands. My community is home to over 350 residents. It has been home to those before me and will be home to those after me. My community is also home to the world's largest uranium refinery. The land on which it occupies is considered a part of our traditional territory, as it is significant to my people in so many ways. This area was once an important gathering place during the summer months. It has been well documented in historical and archaeological studies. This area was utilized for harvesting traditional foods and conducting ceremonial practices. These practices are what made us who we are. The word Mississauga is an anglicized version of the Anishinaabe word Nizwazaging or Michisagi, which means a river with many outlets. This word has many meanings as it describes the land which we derive from. During the construction of the uranium refinery, the sacredness of the site was not honored. Many of our artifacts, including pottery, stone structures, and headstones, were removed and taken to museums. In 2016, a group of youth and elders, including myself, were invited to the Canadian Museum of History in Ottawa to view these artifacts that have still not been rightfully returned home. Carbon samples from the area have been dated to 800 AD. These samples indicate that the area was likely occupied within 200 years of its emergence from the Lake Huron Basin. The scientific evidence supports our oral traditional knowledge. Yet, despite the evidence, there continues to be high disregard for the historical importance of the area, as there is a total absence of Indigenous recognition and documents, alongside the lack of meaningful engagement with Mississauga First Nation. Cameco Corporation's Blind River Refinery currently operates under a license granted by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission that authorizes them to produce 18,000 tons of uranium trioxide. However, by completing modifications and specified conditions, they were given approval to increase their annual production to 24,000 tons of uranium trioxide. This license also authorizes Cameco to possess, transfer, use, process, import, package, transport, manage, store, and dispose of nuclear substances that are required for, associated with, or arise from production of uranium trioxide. With that being said, the government of Canada has a duty to consult and, where appropriate, accommodate Indigenous groups when it considers conduct that might adversely impact potential or established Aboriginal or treaty rights. The duty to consult is an important part of the federal government's activities, including for regulatory project approvals, licensing and authorization of permits, operational decisions, policy development, negotiations, and more. In addition to a constitutional obligation to duty, UNDRIP Article 32.2 also requires member states like Canada to consult and cooperate in good faith before any impact to MFN lands and waters occurs. States shall consult and cooperate in good faith with the Indigenous peoples concerned through their own representative institutions in order to obtain their free and informed consent prior to the approval of any project affecting their lands or territories and other resources, particularly in connection with the development, utilization, or exploitation of mineral, water, and other resources. The current license period of 10 years will end on February 28, 2022. This prompted Cameco Corporation to submit an application seeking a license renewal for the Blind River Refinery for an additional term of 10 years. The refinery has now been in operation for 39 years. It is only 2 kilometers away from my community. This refinery has impacted me before I was born. It has impacted my family and will impact my future children and my future grandchildren. The International Institute of Concern for Public Health completed a study in 1991. The study conducted a series of environmental and health tests which indicated that the local vegetation, including medicinal herbs, commonly consumed by the band, show levels of uranium which are substantially above the background levels measured prior to the startup of the refinery. The report also concluded that combined effects of uranium in drinking water, soils, and vegetation on reserve, as indicated by preliminary testing, poses a potential health risk to band members, and that the Aboriginal lifestyle involves more than the usual Canadian dependence on locally grown food or caught fish and game. The use of herbs for medical purposes and the high level of uranium in drinking and irrigation water were unanticipated when air emissions were set for the chemical uranium refinery. On November 24th, 2021, Mississauga First Nation presented to the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission during the licensing hearing for Chemical Corporation's Blind River Refinery. Based on the concerns of our community, we developed 27 recommendations for the commission. The 27 recommendations address many issues, including consultation, consent, community health, environmental protection, climate change, and the future of the site. Our concerns come from our inherent rights and our treaty rights that must not be infringed upon. As Anishinaabe, we recognize that we have a sacred responsibility to ensure that our traditional territories are respected and protected for the next 7 generations. Our traditional knowledge must always be included when it comes to decisions impacting our rights. This knowledge has been passed down to us by multiple generations of unique knowledge holders. Our free, prior, and informed consent must be sought before any decision in respect of how our lands are to be used and accessed by others is made. MFN Notice of Assertions Traditional Lands Declaration states, Mississauga First Nation has always and never surrendered its obligations to the Creator to exercise its rights to protect its traditional territories and those resources within it since time immemorial. To this day, my community and many other Indigenous communities that are impacted by industries demand to have our concerns heard. To this day, our leadership and people continue to demand that Ontario and Canada respect our treaties. This country was built on our treaties. They are sanctioned within the Canadian Constitution, making them an integral part of the supreme law of the land. I'm so thankful to do this work for our community. Our vibrant history will not be erased. In order for us to move forward, there must be acknowledgement of the historical and ongoing exclusion of the Mississauga from decisions about the site and land. Through this acknowledgement, we can make steps towards reconciliation. Your time has been greatly appreciated. Nimigwachawendam, Bamapikawab Minwa.
Thank you very, very much for that. Our next speaker will be Benedict Kibua Madison, the Assistant Director and Project Specialist for Youth, Climate, and Nuclear Issues, and is a Marshallese of the Marshallese Educational Initiative. Benedict will be giving us a presentation.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you. And I wish to thank the organizers for the opportunity to participate in today's virtual event. So this presentation will highlight why the Marshallese are here in the United States, the ongoing consequences of the US nuclear testing program and climate change in the Marshall Islands, and what Marshallese are doing today to address the climate and nuclear nexus impacting our community. So the Marshall Islands are made up of 5 islands and 29 atolls, and it sits on a vast ocean in the North Central Pacific between Hawaii and Guam. With a mere 70 square miles of land, it is scattered across an exclusive economic zone of 1 million square miles that unifies and separates the islands and atolls that make up the low-lying island nation, home to a small indigenous population. Unfortunately, it is these reasons the United States chose to test nuclear weapons in the Marshall Islands. The islands were under the Japanese during World War II, and after the US pushed the Japanese out, the American government was looking for a place to test or develop nuclear weapons shortly after that. And so the Marshall Islands were chosen, specifically Bikini and Enewetak atolls. And the people who lived on those atolls were removed to make way for large-scale nuclear testing. And like so many people around the world at that time, Marshallese did not know what nuclear weapons were, nor the consequences of nuclear testing. Before the Bikinians were removed on March 6, 1946, the US promised them that everything would be okay and they could return to their homeland as soon as they were done experimenting with weapons of mass destruction. And today, Bikini Atoll is still unsafe for Bikinians to live on. And on Enewetak Atoll, where most of the testing happened, a small population lives there because the US told them that it is, safe for humans to live on, which is not the case. The first nuclear test, codenamed codenamed Able, was detonated on Bikini on July 1st, 1946. 67 nuclear weapons equivalent to 7,200 Hiroshima bombs were tested in the Marshall Islands between 1946 and 1958. And unlike our ancestors who lived long and healthy lives, due to nuclear colonialism, the population suffers from many nuclear-related diseases and is dying young. We have some of the highest rates of cancers, diabetes, and heart problems in the world. So on March 1st, 1954, the US detonated their largest nuclear weapon, codenamed Castle Bravo on Bikini. The weapon was 1,000 times the force of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. And the fallout affected many atolls and islands in the country, especially Rongola Atoll. Locals thought the fallout was snow, so people had skin burns, hairs were falling out, and soon people were getting sick with cancers and women gave birth to deformed babies, many of them with no bones. The US's response was that Castle Bravo was a miscalculation. But after examining US government documents, US scholar Holly Barker wrote about the plight of the women on Rongola Atoll, who were part of a then secret study by the doctors under the Atomic Energy Commission, today's Department of Energy, called Project 4.1, originally titled Study of Response of Human Beings Exposed to Significant Beta and Gamma Radiation due to the fallout from high-yield weapons. And the study happened 6 days after Bravo, and those studied were enrolled without their consent. The people of Rongola were returned to their contaminated atoll 3 years after Bravo and stayed there until Greenpeace evacuated them in 1986. So the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands was an agreement between the US and the United Nations. And although the agreement was established in 1947, a year after the US began testing weapons in the Marshalls, the agreement solidified the United States' use of the islands for nuclear testing. The Marshall Islands became a strategic area, which meant that the United States had total control of the islands and the population. Under the agreement, the US was supposed to care for the health and well-being of the Marshallese people, but the US did not live up to its obligations because it destroyed the environment and people's health. In 1986, the Marshall Islands and the US signed an agreement called the Compact of Free Association, allowing Marshallese to come to the States without visas for education, health, employment, and other reasons that attract people to the States. And the treaty provides economic aid to the Marshall Islands. And in return, the US has a military base in the country. And although the agreement stems from the nuclear testing program, it does not address the ongoing biological and ecological nuclear problems. The compact is set to expire next year in May, but the Biden administration has yet to negotiate with the Marshallese government. We're hoping to have a deal that will address the nuclear legacy and provide adequate compensations. Not only are we dealing with nuclear issues, but we are also on the front line of the climate crisis. The Marshall Islands are 2 meters above sea level on average, putting the country at risk of vanishing under the water due to rising sea levels. In the 1970s, the US sent 8,000 participants with over 2,400 non-military and 5,600 active military personnel to construct a tomb on Enewetak Atoll called the Runadome. It is a nuclear waste storage. However, it is leaking into the fragile environment. It is a concern that the Marshall Islands government has raised with the US countless times. And in fact, the US Congress instructed the Department of Energy back in December of 2019 to assess the dome. And a report came out the following year, June of 2020, basically saying that the dome is fine and that there's no leak, which is not true. And so sea level rise and nuclear waste in the Marshall Islands are significant problems that Marshallese cannot and should not have to address alone. We only emit a tiny percentage of the global greenhouse emissions, and the nuclear waste does not belong to us. And scientists have warned that if the country were underwater today, the structure would break open, releasing 3.1 million cubic feet of radioactive soil and debris, including lethal amounts of plutonium. And these environmental issues will worsen the health issues that already exist in the community, brought on by nuclear testing and the destruction of lands where people cannot grow food due to radiation. So they depend on the importation of unhealthy foods such as ramen, rice, canned food, and so forth, contributing to diabetes, heart problems, and other chronic health issues. The Marshall Islands have created a national adaptation plan to mitigate and adapt to the environmental changes due to climate change. One significant focus under the adaptation plan is to elevate the country. And the cost of maintaining the status quo over all of the islands and atolls over time is huge for a small island nation. The government believes it will be in the tens of billions of dollars. The Marshall Islands has a long history of advocacy for nuclear justice, dating back to the United Nations trusteeship of the islands when the United States began its nuclear testing program. Marshallese leaders and community members, together with allies around the world, have been fighting for justice, and within the last 4 or 5 decades, fighting for climate justice. The Marshall Islands led a nuclear lawsuit against nuclear weapon states in 2014 with the help of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. We did not win the lawsuit, however, it did receive international attention. There is a group of nations called the Higher Ambition Coalition, and the Marshall Islands created this group during the Paris climate talks. You know, while big emitting countries were still undecided on whether to sign the Paris Agreement or not, the Marshall Islands was working behind the scenes to get 190 plus countries to sign on through the Higher Ambition Coalition. But aside from the Paris Accord, Marshallese leaders and community members have participated in COP meetings and other important conferences for Marshallese to take part in. And for decades, Marshallese have used mediums such as songs, poems, paintings and drawings, skits, movies, and other forms of protest or activism to share our nuclear and climate stories with the world. Young Marshallese like Kathy Jedno Kitchener, Selena Lamb, and countless others are helping to raise awareness about these environmental issues affecting us, our loved ones, culture, people, and islands. So one of our goals at the Marshallese Educational Initiative, together with the Reverse the Trend, is to educate young people about the twin issues of nuclear and climate change. And last year, several Marshallese youth participated in monthly workshops led by lovely Yamayam and Christian. 6 Marshallese youth, including myself, wrote this poem called A Journey Home. And it is a poem that reflects on the different places that each of us calls home, whether it be Arkansas, where the largest concentration of Marshallese resides outside of the Marshall Islands, our ancestral homeland, or our planet. It also reflects the importance of land to Marshallese. Like other cultures, land is a part of our Marshallese identity. And so without further ado, we'll listen to this audio of A Journey Home by Marcina Langren. And apologies because the video is not ready yet, but hope to share that in the coming months.
A journey home. My feet this place.
So sorry, we're experiencing some technical issues, so I'm going to ask a colleague, Gian, to play it from her computer. Please, Gian.
A journey home. My feet move through fresh mud after the rain. Spring leaves crunch under my shoes. Careful not to step on the many-legged creatures that call this place home. Clouds appear when I breathe out. This earth is my home too. I find new paths every day, souls full of memories that I have made. Home is in the stillness. Miles and miles of breathtaking. Home is in the loud hooting during football games. Woo, pig, suey, and the crisp hiss of a soda can pried open on a summer day. Home is in the riot of my bedroom, where purple string lights dangle like dancing punk fairies as I sing along loops of my favorite songs. I find home when I travel, like that one time in Seattle, a city that smells of brine brewed from the sea. Skinned fish and homemade cheese sit pretty under the patter of rain and the squabble of seagulls bathing in the bay. But there is one home I long for, the Marshall Atolls, daughters of the ocean, forged by primordial coral. They call my name. My feet move through the sand, damp from the waves. They pull me. Palms seek the cool touch of sea foam like delicate lace. These islands are my inheritance, earthly gems under opulent stars. But I cannot walk further. The water is a terrifying mood, eating away the island lagoons, seawalls battered, now crumbling. Storms split the leaning palms, the same ones swallowed by nuclear plumes many years ago. Men gave atom bombs a place in world history. But what about this home? Smudged out of the story, I fear people only saw the dirty red cloud and not the bruised earth below. In the future, will these island daughters sink to the ocean floor? I fear people only see a drowned land instead of an earth worth saving. These questions stump me, but still I stitch a map to connect what matters most. My family, my culture, my Marshall Island home. A map of the Marshalls, not as a place, but a people to guide a future generation whose feet will meet the islands with love and without fear. But I long to find a path towards home, the emerald countryside or the blue Pacific tides that will stay safe, where my children can tumble into a beautiful brightness and feel earth a stable bedrock under their newly formed souls, while their little palms, fingers splayed, reach for the sky, a limitless canvas where time is constant and still.
Thank you so much for that. Following the presentations that we've seen and the audio presentation as well, we are left with lots to think about and lots of powerful messages to go on the rest of our day with. Now we are open for interactive discussion between the presenters and participants as well, if need be. Now I open the floor.
So please raise your hand in the virtual, please use the raise hand function, or please submit your question in the chat box.
Thank you. And just a note to the speakers, if you could turn your videos on so we can spotlight you so that everybody can see you during the discussion.
Yes, and I think that as people are preparing their questions, I know, Emma, we have, there are some questions that have been submitted already to us, correct?
Yes, I think Casey's got those for us.
Yes. So Casey, would you like to
Yeah, so there was one question I saved during Dr. Turner's speech. Let me pull it up. Okay, so the question was, were there any nuclear engineers or supporters invited to observe this meeting? I guess that isn't really much. I'm sorry. If anyone would like to speak about it, that's fine.
So I know that there were Casey and the team prepared questions already in advance, so perhaps one of those questions can be posed. Thank you.
All right, I'll read one now. So the first question we have prepared is, what do you believe is needed to start for countries like the United States to take responsibility for their past use of nuclear weapons and the continued effect they have today?
I can take an initial stab at that question. I do think that a large part of this is sort of not sort of, is systemic in how the nuclear field is taught and educated and framed. You know, it's very uncommon for courses in a nuclear engineering program or a radiological sciences program, which is, of course, oftentimes the entry point to what the community recognizes as expertise on these issues, or the way that knowledge is produced in this form or in this field. It's very uncommon for those courses, those forms of advancement to include any discussion about any of these issues, or just about, you know, anything beyond the technical advancements and sort of the policies that one must learn to, you know, design a reactor or or work in the weapons space. And I think that it's really like, it's not criminal, obviously, like it's not literally a crime, but in some ways it is like morally criminal, that we're, and ethically criminal, that like this is an entire field that it's not as if there are fringe, sort of like fringe impacts to human life and to specific communities in particular, but this is very systemic in the whole field. And I think a really great point of action, a one starting point could be like if every nuclear program, for example, committed to having at least one course, but even just one course as a required part of, you know, an engineering curriculum that was about the legacy or the human cost or the, you know, the legacy of inequity that this field has created. That does not exist right now. And if it does exist in places, it's an elective, it's a specialty, it's a fringe thing, and this should really be embedded into the process of what it means to become an expert in nuclear technology.
Can I hear that question again one more time?
Yes, I can read out the question for you. What do you believe is needed to start for countries like the United States to take responsibility for their past use of nuclear weapons and the continued effect they have today?
Coming from the Navajo people, it's like you talk to deaf ears when it comes to the United States government, because I, for one, feel that since the time that uranium was mined, it was in a place where people needed some kind of economic development so that they were able to work and get some money. But the resource was uranium mining, and the people were not told uranium was hazardous and that it could affect their health. The people, meaning when I say the people, I'm talking about the Navajo miners. The Navajo miners were not given safety gear. The Navajo miners were not told that ventilation to the underground mining needed to be there. And they were not told that the yellow stuff that got on them when they did the explosion underground to dig up the uranium, that yellow cake was dangerous. And their families came to the mines and they camped out there when they did the mining, that the family were all exposed to this yellow dust. The people were not told that the water underground in the mines was contaminated. They tasted the water was cold, it tastes good. They brought that water back up from the mine and gave it to the family up on the surface of the land of the mine. And so everybody was exposed to it. Mothers washed the clothes of the husbands that worked in the mine with the children's clothes, going to the laundromat. So now everybody is totally exposed and contaminated with this radioactive dust. I don't think the United States government ever took that to heart. Their thing was that they knew it was hazardous. And they wanted to see if how long it would take for the Navajo people that work in the uranium mines, what would happen to them. It was like a study. It was a study. So the Navajo people were studying a research of uranium mine at the same time mining the uranium mine so that they can be used for nuclear weapons. It's ironic that they would put Navajo people at jeopardy of their lives, even as up to today. The abandoned mines that are not taken care of, the companies came and left the mines. The people thought that it was safe to use those materials that were left behind to build their homes. The geyser counters, it exceeds uranium, natural uranium standards, and it's a mess. And so my thing is, how is the United States going to be? That's why I said deaf ears. They don't understand, and it doesn't matter to them. And I feel that this is genocide. I feel that this is racism. From the beginning, when we came, we were not, they came here and they made a government and they wrote the Constitution, and it was only for their Constitution. It was not the Constitution for the Navajo people or Native Americans in this country. We were not citizens, even though we lived on this land before they came. We were not citizens. We were not allowed to vote. And so I just don't see how the government is going to really address these things. And I'm going to add one thing. When the Japanese people were bombed during World War II, they were reclamated before the Navajo people. The Navajo people dug up all this uranium and the industry of nuclear weapons, and everything was moving forward. The Navajo people were never recognized as there should be some reclamation given to them. The Japanese people got it first before the Navajo people. And that says to me that there's some level, and I know that Dr. Turner kind of brought it up. You know, there's good things of nuclear power. It's good for reversing, I guess, the climate change, but it's not good in the sense of health. It's not good when a bomb hits and so many people die all at one time. How is that good? And then you got the climate change, all the fumes that are going up into the air. I read somewhere that since they can't find a waste dump for the uranium, that they're trying to think that maybe they can put it up in space so it can float around up there in the air, in the atmosphere. And then that becomes a part of the air that we breathe. It just doesn't have any, to me, it doesn't make any sense. The thing that we did in Salzburg, Austria, was that we said, indigenous people that were there, we said no more uranium mine, because it has affected our lifestyle. It's shortening our lifestyle. We're not living as long. We're dying of cancer, different kinds of cancer. And we took it up to the Alps. We drove a bus up on top of the Alps that looked like the bus was gonna fall off the mountain, risking our lives just to put something high above the ground to maybe believe that the spirits and the creator can help us, not the United States. That's the way I feel. I think that the United States government, if they're going to do something, it has to change drastically, and I don't think that's coming soon. If I answered your question, I just come from a real defensive mode, and I have a passion for it because I've seen my people cry. I've seen my people suffer. I've seen people how they're hauling water, and because their water is so contaminated, they have to drive hours to bring water in. I don't understand. If in Navajo land, we don't have any infrastructure. We're like third world country, and the United States doesn't take care of that or recognize it. I hate to say that, but that's the way it is for Indian people in this country. We're Indian people. And Black folks are just the same way when they're treated just like us. We're part of, if you're not that Caucasian race, then you don't have a level of leverage to support your case unless you have attorneys and try to fight your case. But that's a long stretch because everything takes its time to get where it needs to go. And I just don't feel there's really anything at this point to really try to, that's why I say our complaint is on deaf ears.
Thank you for taking the time to answer that question, both of you. It was great to hear your responses. We did receive another question from the chat, and this question reads, how can we reconnect the needs of Indigenous communities with the needs of nuclear countries? So whoever would like to take on that question first, feel free.
Repeat that question one more time.
Of course. How can we reconnect the needs of Indigenous communities with the needs of nuclear countries?
How can you reach, what's that next word?
Reconnect the needs.
Oh, reconnect. I'll take a shot at it. I'm gonna say, go ahead, Peyton, go ahead.
I was just going to say that the needs of Indigenous communities aren't in alignment with the needs of the country and nuclear industry. When we think about an Indigenous perspective, we think about the way that the land and the people and the animals and all that is interconnected. But when we hear these reports and these technical people come to our communities and share these stories about how the impacts are below the standard, they're below a certain standard, but we know that our land is being affected. We see the impacts on our river. People are afraid to consume fish that we normally would harvest. For instance, we have an abundance of lake sturgeon in the Mississauga River. Each year they come to this area and they spawn. And the refinery is located not even a kilometer away from the river itself. And the area was used for wild rice and cranberries, and our community is scared to consume these. So I don't, unless we can try to share that perspective of, it's more of like a reciprocal relationship with the land, and until people can kind of grasp that concept, we can't necessarily make them connected.
I want to add to this as well. I agree with everything that Peyton said. This is exactly right. And it also made me think of something that Esther just said in her last remarks. When we think about reconciling the needs of Indigenous communities and Indigenous nations with the needs of nuclear countries or of nuclear stakeholders, the reason there's an issue is because underlying there has been this foundation, as Esther pointed out, of not fully treating people based on their race, their ethnicity, their religion, etc., as citizens or as stakeholders. So if we can't, and by we, I mean, if the nuclear community cannot honestly reflect on the different ways that different groups of people are not considered stakeholders in this conversation, or not considered, participants in this conversation, it will never be reconciled. And so, you know, there will be different approaches, you know, to try and convince people in a different way that this is good for you or whatever. But if, you know, when someone is an equal stakeholder in a conversation, you listen to them, you take in their point of view, and you allow that point of view to really change your preconceived notion, and both parties do that, right? The nuclear field does not treat communities, and in particular, Indigenous communities, as full stakeholders. And that's what needs to change fundamentally.
I believe, this is Esther, I believe that when we all reach a point of humanities, we don't look at color, we don't look at race, we all believe that we have a right that was given to all of us, we may reconnect. But as long as we're always going to be divided, then I think that the reconnection is harder to make that happen. And I think reconnection is only from, say like the electronic satellite internet or anything falls off the grid, and we're all in a need of survival. We're looking for survival. That's where the reconnection comes, because we're all in one that we need to survive as a group. As long as that survival is not desperate to everybody, I believe as corporate companies have desecrated not only Mother Earth, but the water, the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, by dropping bombs and testing bombs like the Marshall Island report. Then you got the law of gravity also acting. As long as you are doing these things, imagine an earthquake. You're not ready for an earthquake. It just happens at that second. You don't have time to flinch. You don't have time. It happens, and the force of nature is tremendous. Not only an earthquake, the force of the wind, tornadoes, and not only the wind, but the water, tsunamis, hurricanes. It don't wait for you. And scientific things that are built to withstand certain force of power doesn't happen. They get washed away, and you would never even know anything was there. And so as Native people, we say, this is our Mother Earth. The sky is our father's sky. The sun is our father's sun. The moon is our mother moon. And these are the cosmology, the archaeological ways of order that was set. It's a big machine that's on a national scale, natural scale. As long as you messed with the machine, then things start to fall out of order. And after a while, you have a dysfunction. So as Native Americans, as Navajo people, we believe, just like Peyton said, everything is interconnected. And once those things are put out of order, then we have climate change. Then we have the oceans rising. Then we have people dying. There's a great amount of destruction that's going to happen. And I think those forces are talking to us and telling us how we're supposed to be. And as young folks, of different race and all over the world. I appreciate your effort and you're trying to understand this because you're the group that's going to take it forward for us. I'm an elder. We always talk like that. That's where you hear Maya Angelou say, reach down and pull up the person behind you. That's what you're doing. You're reaching down and you're going to pull up the people that are behind you, which are younger people, the next generation. We have been there and we're pulling you up and you guys are there. And I think that you can read into these things, the power of the environment. There's so much power there. The power is not in the internet. The power is not in nuclear energy. The power is in the natural forces of air, water, fire, all these things. And that's where the connection, if you're going to do any connection, the reconnection is with them so that the forces, you know, calm down and things kind of, you have to learn how to respect these things. And that's my thing. And I don't think when it comes to government and corporations, I think that's greed, and greed leads to poverty. That's the way I understand it as a Navajo person. Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time to answer to all of our speakers. Our final question today will be, the cancer rate has escalated at Mississauga First Nation. Is this because, give me a moment, is this because Cameco Uranium Refinery is 1.6 from our community and Cameco site located beside Mississauga River?
So I know that a lot of people in my community have suffered things like cancer, and we hear that the rate of cancer is increasing. And when we bring these concerns forward, they're kind of just, well, you know, your reserve is located along the Highway 17 corridor, so the air emissions from vehicles passing through, and it's kind of like placing that blame on other aspects, and how the way that the other things that are happening around our community are impacting the health. But, you know, we know that uranium is radioactive and does impact the health of our community. And we know that things have happened in the past that were not right. There was at one point a release of uranium into the air from an incinerator, and it was an incident that went unreported for a short period. And I think we recognize the responsibility that we do need to conduct health studies, but it's building the capacity to do that and trying to find funding to complete these studies that are going to be more thorough and intensive. So until we can get that data, we can't necessarily say that it's because of one thing, but we know that it is.
Thank you for answering that question. I believe that concludes our question period for this portion. Now we're going to go into some reflections that will be given by Verna Gupta, who is a PhD student at the University of British Columbia and is affiliated with RTT Canada.
Thanks, Rush. I'm just gonna summarize what we've learned today. This is, for me, been very very educating experience. I come from India and I've worked with Indigenous communities there that live around uranium mines and work in the uranium mines there. And every time I learn about the scale of the issue here, it's shocking, because I thought my government was bad. I just look at just the scale of nuclear tests here, the amount of uranium mining and the impact on Indigenous people is really, it's extensive. and it's very shocking for me. So just going over, I'm just gonna go over what I learned today. And our first speaker was Dr. Caitlin Turner. And she talked about growing up with the threat of climate change, as a lot of young people are growing up today, and being told that nuclear energy is a solution to that, and was indispensable in the fight against climate change. But in her own training as a nuclear engineer, she learned about all the different challenges, technical, social, and economic challenges that nuclear energy has, and how this kind of technical discussion keeps away the real discussion that we need to have on nuclear issues, that is equity and justice. Then our elder Esther Yazzie Lewis reminded us of how important it is to hear Indigenous communities' experience of nuclear fuel cycles. She talked about uranium mining in Navajo nations and the impact of land, air, and water there. Her experience with working in these communities and collecting all the different testimonies from people who had suffered the impacts of uranium mining. She talked about how, and we are very grateful to have her experience to make us understand how Indigenous people's perspectives on these issues can really help us understand more deeply what needs to be done. So we're very grateful for that. Then we moved on to Peyton, and she from the Misagua First Nation. And she talked about the construction of uranium refinery in the sacred, which was constructed after the sacred lands were desecrated of her community and were transported to museums. There was no regard for the historical importance of this area. She talked about a study that was conducted in 1991 that showed that the vegetation and the water in that area had very high levels of uranium, much higher than before the construction of the refinery. And the struggle of Misagua Nation to be heard by the US government continues to this day. Then we moved to Benedict Madison, who talked about the Marshallese diaspora and the ongoing impacts of nuclear programs on Marshall Islands as a result of testing of nuclear weapons, especially the Bikini and Eniwetok atolls, the people here who were told that it would be fine before the testing of the nuclear weapons. There were about 67 nuclear weapons that were tested, and the populations there continue to suffer from health impacts. And a lot of people are dying young there now. She talked about the incident and the testing of Castle Bravo that caused a lot of suffering. It was 1,000th the power of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, which the US government just responded by saying that it was a miscalculation. Moreover, the women who suffered from this fallout were part of a secret study and were enrolled without their consent by the US government. This is a practice that other Indigenous communities have also talked about. And he talked about the dual impact that the people of Marshall Islands are facing with climate change and nuclear weapons, and their initiative and advocacy against both of these worldwide. So I really want to thank everyone to be part of this. I myself have learned a lot from this discussion, and I hope everybody took away something.
Thank you, Prerna, for summarizing the presentations that were given. And thank you to the rest of our presenters for their powerful remarks. As of now, Reverse the Trend operates in several chapters, including Canada, Japan, South Asia, and Korea. And at the moment, Reverse the Trend Canada is taking many initiatives to include Indigenous voices in its projects, such as bringing attention to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons through campaigns such as the ICANN Cities Appeal. Reverse the Trend, since its initial launch, has taken much focus and attention towards Indigenous youth and Indigenous voices and elders who need to be encouraged and given the spotlight to talk about these very important issues that oftentimes affect Indigenous communities amongst other communities as well. I will open the floor now to Emma, who will be giving an announcement.
Hi, yes, thank you so much, Roj. And also thank you to everyone. I just really want to express my deepest gratitude to all of our speakers, everyone who, joined today, everyone working behind the scenes. It feels like my great fortune to have been here with you today. So thank you so much. And as Roj said, I have one announcement. It's about Reverse the Trend, or RTT, which, thank you. There's our contact. If you don't know about us, the email is in the chat, but we are a project that aims to amplify the voices of young people, primarily those coming from frontline communities who have been directly affected by nuclear weapons and climate change. And this Friday, actually, the 21st of January, is going to be exactly 1 year since we launched this project last year on January 21st, actually 1 day before the entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And so to commemorate this sort of 1 year anniversary or birthday, we're having an event on Friday at 7 p.m. And we'll get to hear from some of our advisors, many of our members from some of the chapters that Roj mentioned. And, we've gained so much momentum in 1 year and been so active, I think. And so, to all supporters of RTT or those who are interested in learning more, we really hope that you will join us on Friday. It will be 7 p.m. Eastern. If you receive our email updates, you can find the information there, or if you follow us on Instagram soon, the registration information, the link will be there. So yes, thank you so much. That was my announcement, and back to you, Roj.
It was wonderful and very exciting for Reverse the Trend, as well as the anniversary coming up this Friday. Now, based on the chat, we will be doing a group photo at the end. But again, just one more thanks to all of the wonderful presenters. This was a very well-needed conversation that we had. And I think all of our participants have a lot to take away from this and a lot to think about in moving forward in their own activities and initiatives in this movement as activists.
So I should share that before we do the photo that please turn on your cameras, and that the photo will be used on our social media platforms we posted there, as well as our website. We're just waiting for a few more people to turn on their cameras if they would like to be featured in the photo. Okay, so Emma, would you like to take the photo?
Yes, sure. Okay, we have 2 pages, so I'm going to take them both. All right, there we go. All right, here goes the first page one. Oh, wait. Someone's just written in the chat, so I'm going to wait for that to go away. There we go. All right. 1, 2, 3. Great. And now the second page. All right. 1, 2, 3. Smile. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, everyone. And this concludes our event.
Funny, but that's.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
you.
Thanks, everyone. Great